That's the one. So it's the few and the proud this evening, which is excellent. And we are looking at a little bit of Parashat Miketz, which is only appropriate, which is just what we read this past week. Hopefully you can see that. And hello, Lorraine.
Hello, Adam. Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So just a little bit of the context here, because there's actually a huge amount of Zohar and Parashat Miketz, is we've got Joseph, of course, in the Pharaoh's palace, basically, having been appointed as the vizier of Egypt. And Pharaoh appointed Joseph into that role precisely because Joseph was the one to interpret his dream and to suggest that the dreams which he had at the very beginning of the parasha were ones which depicted 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine to follow. Hi, Robin. So Pharaoh was so keen on Joseph's interpretation that he not only agreed with him, but then gave him a job immediately. So Joseph has been made vizier of Egypt, and in particular is in charge of the agricultural plan that he suggested, which is to hoard the grain for the first 7 years so that there's enough to sustain the people for the latter 7 years. Turns out Joseph was right, and exactly as he described happens. And as a result, in the famine years, his father and brothers, all the way back in Canaan, who haven't seen him in probably 20 years, end up sending themselves down to Egypt to beg for rations, as many other people are from around the world. And Joseph ends up in the incredible position of secretly having the opportunity to exert power over his brothers. His brothers are now adults, as he is. He's in his 30s during this, probably late 30s. His brothers are mostly older than him, with the exception of Benjamin, who's a little bit younger. And Joseph finds himself disguised as an Egyptian, named as an Egyptian, speaking Egyptian, with his brothers bowing down to him as the vizier of Egypt. They have no idea it's him, asking him if he can give them rations for the famine so they can bring it back to Canaan. He plays a trick on them, one of several tricks, in which he basically holds one of the brothers hostage in exchange to say that they need to go back. He accuses them of being spies and says they need to go back and get their littlest brother and bring him back, and that way he'll believe them, which doesn't really make sense. I mean, it's a kind of a weird play on behalf of a vizier who has no relationship to these people. But they do eventually what he says, and they bring Benjamin back. And the moment the Zohar is now commenting on is the moment when Benjamin, his only full brother, right? Benjamin and Joseph both share a mother in Rachel, as well as a father in Jacob. He's the one who he's closest to, and who, when he was kicked out of the family and left to die in a pit, Benjamin was probably a very young boy, so he hasn't seen him for a very long time. So the moment the Zohar picks up on is the moment where he sees Benjamin, and it describes it as it quotes here, Genesis 43. He raised his eyes and saw Benjamin, his brother, his mother's son. And what they want to explore is kind of the emotional significance of this moment, right? Of Joseph, who's waited all this time to try and maybe come to terms with his brothers. Benjamin is the one he holds least responsible because Benjamin was only a little kid. So Benjamin didn't contribute to throwing him into the pit. Benjamin is his full sibling. Benjamin is now his father's favorite child, since Joseph was his favorite, but his father believes him to be dead. He has no idea he's actually running Egypt. There's incredible amount of psychodrama. It is a soap opera extraordinaire going on in these chapters of Genesis. And the Zohar is a really interesting take on the emotional significance of this moment, which is where we're picking up with Rabbi Chia. So, who wants to read first?
I'll start.
Hey, Lee.
I beat you to it. Yeah, sure. Okay, so Rabbi Chia opened, hope deferred is a sickness of heart, but a desire come true is a tree of life, from Proverbs 13:12. Hope deferred, as we have learned, a person should not examine whether his request before God has been fulfilled or not. Why? Because if he does so, numerous masters of judgment come to examine his deeds. This is a mystery, for his examination of that request causes him sickness of heart. Who is sickness of heart? The one constantly poised to accuse above and below.
Okay. Let's just try and understand what they're doing here with this verse from Proverbs. First of all, what is the significance of this proverb? Which is rendered quite nicely in English here. Hope deferred is sickness of heart, but a desire come true is a tree of life. What does that mean?
Maybe it's about growth. Is it about growth? Desire come true as a tree of life, so it gives an opportunity to grow.
I like that. When something happens that you want, it's an opportunity for growth, perhaps. Similarly, when you desire something, when you hope for something, but it doesn't come true, it's deferred, right? It's put off. It can make you really, really mad, right? The sickness of heart is pretty strong language, especially considering the significance of heart as a representation of the mind very often in Hebrew. So, you can go mad waiting for something you're hoping on, but when your desires do come true, it's like a tree of life, right? It regenerates, it grows, you kind of benefit from it. What's the message you would say of such a proverb?
It reads to me as being like, don't pin your well-being or happiness on possibilities in the future, and rather have gratitude for the present.
Okay, very nice. Yeah, right. Hope can be a very dangerous thing, because when it doesn't work out, it can really do a lot of damage. So perhaps a suggestion, as you say, Lee, that it's about not pinning your hopes, not pinning your happiness on hopes of what might happen. Instead, being pleasantly surprised when your desires do come true, but not necessarily waiting on them.
Yeah.
What does the Zohar think it means?
It
Is it
seems
something? Oh, sorry.
you go. I've spoken.
Is it something about judgment? Well, it says judgment. So sickness of heart, I guess, is talking about Satan. Is that right? The accuser, the one constantly poised to accuse above and below.
Seems like it. Yeah, seems like they suggest that what it means when it says sickness of heart comes upon you is that you're kind of hunted by Satan.
And I guess, yeah, it's weird, isn't it? So it's like you're being judged while you're hoping.
Absolutely. That's the dilemma here, isn't it? Right, and they cite this kind of so-called teaching, as we've learned. A person should not examine whether their request before God has been fulfilled or not. What does that mean?
This is going to sound really wacky, but it makes me think of quantum physics, and uncertainty. So there's this idea that with certain subatomic particles, that the state they are in isn't determined until they are observed and measured. And it kind of feels like that to me, that by examining your desires or like giving attention and observation to your hopes and desires, that actually cements whether or not they'll come true, and tends to appear to be like the negative. So that's what it feels like to me, is that like by looking at your hopes and desires, you're negatively affecting them.
I love that. The observation of one aspect cements the other. It's very nice.
Sort of Fermat's last theorem, isn't it? Is that right? Is that what it is? I went to see a play about it a long time ago.
This is Heisenberg. This one, the uncertainty principle.
Uncertainty principle.
There was a great play about it. I forget what it's called.
Yeah, by Michael Frayn, maybe.
Something like that. They imagine Heisenberg and someone else having a conversation. Is that the play?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it is. Yeah.
So it's a fascinating insight because it does seem to suggest this weird kind of sense that if you dwell on what you want, right? If you examine whether if you want something from God and you've asked something of God, excuse me, and then you constantly are examining it, going, did it come true? Didn't it come true? Is it going to happen today? If you're kind of obsessively looking at it, then it's not going to happen, right? You kind of jinx it almost. And instead you invite misery, right? By constantly examining your desires, by constantly going, I don't know, did it happen yet? God's not a vending machine where you can just push a button and the thing you want happens. So actually the best thing is not to dwell on it, it seems, right? To want things, but not necessarily to be constantly observing your own desire in that regard.
Is it like, because you're questioning, because you're sort of questioning God in a way by asking if it's been fulfilled, you're inviting judgment upon yourself, and actually you're being judged for that questioning, and for it's like, I guess it goes back to what I think we've spoken about before, about the nature of prayer and sort of asking for stuff. That's not really what prayers should be about, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an interesting idea that when you sit there and examine God's actions, what you're inviting is the angels to go, well, you haven't been so great either, and to examine your deeds. There's a weird kind of parallelism to that.
Seems that there's also a parallel to what we talked about with dreams and like uttering your dreams to someone else. It feels like it has a similar sort of effect, like this act of observance of directing your attention towards it, or manifesting it in this more rigid way. Because when you have a hope or a desire, it's not necessarily like really neatly or eloquently verbalized in your head, right? You don't necessarily spell out precisely what it is you want or desire. It tends to be more like a feeling. I think the same goes for like plans and dreams. It's like when you try and verbalize them and turn them into something more concrete, it's like this sort of observance, this inspection of them that affects them in some way.
Yeah, I love that. When you tell someone your dreams, all of a sudden they're going to be interpreted negatively. There's certain kind of concretizing these vague ideas that tends to be negative. Instead, we have to kind of sit with the uncertainty about whether or not our hopes come true. But there's a second half of the verse, right? So, Lee, do you want to do another paragraph here?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I just dropped my mouse. Okay, so but a desire, come true, is a tree of life. We have learnt. Whoever wants the Blessed Holy One to accept his prayer should engage in Torah, which is a tree of life. Then a desire, comes. Who is desire? The rung holding all prayers of the world, conveying them into the presence of the king. Here is written comes, and there is written in the evening she comes. This is a desire comes, coming before the supernal king to fulfill the desire of that human being.
Okay, so what's going on here? What's the flip side of this proverb?
It sounds like the desires come true are like a connection through the Shekhinah to the Deferred and up through to God.
Right. Okay. So desire is kind of conveyed in some way. They use this quote from Esther, which is completely out of context, right? In the evening, she comes, describing a banquet, right, where the Queen Esther is going to. Here, it's used out of context to describe the fact that kind of the desires that people have each day are kind of brought before God, and they're fulfilled kind of if they're connected in some way to Torah study and religious observance, because of course there's a sympathetic magic to this. The verse says a desire come true is a tree of life, and we also say that Torah is a tree of life to those who hold fast to her. So therefore, if you want your desires to come true, you should study Torah, and thereby your desires are kind of channeled upwards in the right way, rather than sitting there and waiting for it to happen and going, oh, I don't know, did my desire become fulfilled yet? If you engage with Torah study, then you're more likely for your desire to get where it's supposed to be. Which is a very rabbinic answer, of course.
But is there also something about the framing of what a desire can be, or a legitimate desire, if you like? So a desire that will be fulfilled has to be a desire that comes through engagement with Torah. See what I mean? So it sort of constrains legitimate desires.
Yeah, perhaps so. If whoever wants the Basilian to accept his prayer should engage in Torah, which is a tree of life, then a desire comes. So there's a linking between those two things.
Yeah.
And also they change, don't they, from, we wouldn't normally say who is desire. We would say what. You know, they animate desire and make it.
But they read everything hyper literally, don't they? Above they said, who is sickness of heart, right? Yeah. And here it's, who is desire? Meaning they're reading these words that are used as regular nouns, as proper nouns.
Yeah.
Desire, capital D. It's like, you know, all of a sudden they're thinking of everything in an angelic sense, as a being. Emotions become beings so much in the Zohar.
Is ba'ah here? Like, isn't in modern Hebrew, isn't that to come?
Yep. Yeah, the feminine past tense singular. She came.
She came. It really reminds me of Zen. This bit, you know, about it's like if you're in the present moment, then you're okay. But if you're in the past, you know, looking back at yourself, or someone else is judging you, you're outside of yourself. You know, like if you take it in a more, you know, you talk about being accused above and below. It could be we accuse ourselves all the time, don't we? We're like outside of ourselves, kind of saying, "Oh, you did that wrong," or "You're no good," or whatever it is. And with the desire, if you come before the presence of the King, so you come into the present, into the here and now, then everything will come towards you.
Does the Zohar do this with other sort of emotions and concepts of personifying them in this way, like desire, hope?
Yeah, often. I mean, it's not unusual for the Zohar to kind of play with a lot of these things, and the language is also very, very, very limited. I mean, just to pop over and have a look at what this section of Proverbs looks like, because Proverbs is not a book we study very often, actually ever. Right, so this is chapter 13 where we are, and you can see actually how all of these are phrased in these very short couplets. Right, ones that are very hard to translate. Ben Hacham Musar Av, the son of someone who's wise is instructed by his father, has here. Velates lo shama ga'ara, but someone who laughs doesn't hear rebuke. All of these could be translated lots of ways. They're proverbs, right? They're almost idiomatic expressions that are very difficult to translate. And some of these are very famous. Right? Some of these are things that we talk about, that we quote all the time. Pride comes before the fall. You know, the early bird gets the worm. All of these things, a lot of these come from the book of Proverbs itself, all of which are supposedly written by Solomon. And the one in question here, you can see how short it is, and also how unusual the language is. It doesn't say tikva. It talks about hope. Tochelet mimushacha machalat lev. Tochelet is a different word entirely. It's more like a tochelet is like a beginning almost. It's related to the word for something starting. It's kind of a, I don't know what the best word is in English. I don't know that hope is the best word, but it, you know, something that you're an intention, maybe something you're setting out to do, which is drawn away, can be a heart sickness. Ve'etz chaim, and a tree of life is ta'ava ba'a, when a when a pleasure comes, or literally, more literally, when lust comes, right? Ta'ava is quite a strong word for appetite or lust, or it's not just any desire. So there's actually a lot more nuance to much of this that isn't captured by the English, and it's very hard to capture in any translation. And all of these things, we use these all the time. Parat hacham makor chaim, the teaching of the wise is a source of life. Lasur mi mokshe mavet, right? To keep one from the snares of death. And they're all phrased in these not rhyming, but metric couplets. And it goes on and on and on and on. So just to give a little bit of context, these are really hard passages to try and understand. And exactly what it means when it talks about hope or when it talks about desire are actually really hard. And that's part of the reason that the Zohar is looking at these as proper nouns. It's because they're very rare Hebrew words sometimes. Tochelet and ta'ava are not the usual words for hope and desire. And there's literally only 8 words in the whole thing. So it's very, very terse. But we can get a sense in some way of what the Zohar is trying to make this mean through its commentary here. And it is, in some way, it is kind of in the same Zen sense of being open to many interpretations, almost like a koan, right? It's almost a nonsensical phrase, which we then read so much meaning into. And they're doing that many times over. Remember, all of this is about Joseph somehow. We're going to come back to that. So let's see where they go next. Someone else want to read from Alternatively? In blue.
Yeah, I'll read her. Okay.
Sorry.
Alternatively, hope deferred is sickness of the heart, but a desire comes true is a tree of life. Come and see, hope deferred, a place where that word is delivered, another place, undesirable, delayed there. It is passed from hand to hand and sometimes never arrives. Why? Because it is diffused and delayed among all those empowered to bring it down to the world.
So what's the suggestion of Zohar here as to why sometimes one's hope might not come true? What's the mechanics of disappointment?
Sounds like it's like it gets when it's a hope is sort of like attached or passed to a higher being, and then they sort of pass the buck, passing it between each other, passing it around, and it never sort of reaches its final destination.
Yeah, it gets caught up in bureaucratic red tape. It gets lost somewhere in a filing cabinet. There's a sense here that actually sometimes what we want doesn't happen purely because it's just really complicated and desires don't always actually make it to where they're supposed to be. There's too many people involved, too many beings, and it sometimes gets too diffuse and it can't come to fruition the way that we might want.
It makes you think of the idea that, for something to come about to us as humans might seem quite straightforward, but that might require millions of tiny little things to happen throughout the universe. So to us, why is this taking months or years? But that many little nudges and things have got to happen for the end to sort of come to fruition.
Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? The world's a big place. We see only from our own point of view, examining and waiting, going, why doesn't the thing I want happen? But there's a much bigger picture, right, which Zohar is trying to get us to think about to some degree.
The reality is, it feels like that, doesn't it? We all hope for certain things, or not we all, but many of us hope for certain things, and it does seem to be really hard to get to those things. Although the people hope for them,
just seems to get lost along the way sometimes.
Yeah,
it's actually kind of comforting, the idea that it's just bureaucratic nightmare up there in Angel Land. Like nothing ever gets through. You send the form, it gets lost. It is something kind of very comically relatable about this idea that, all these people are handling human desires and they just get lost in the process.
Yeah.
I feel there's
Well,
an esoteric, esoteric. I know is a funny word to use here, but a more esoteric angle to take. That might be something like the desire being this more intellectual. Sorry, the hope being a more intellectual or like articulated desire. Is one that gets tied up in the bureaucracy of like reason and causality and what's physically possible in the world. Whereas an actual desire, like a raw desire in its unarticulated form, isn't subject to the same rules of physics as the articulated hope. And so it has more potential for actually blossoming into something real in the world because it doesn't have to conform necessarily to the rules of reality.
Yeah, it's a great idea, and it's a great question, right? What's the difference in the Hebrew between tochelet and ta'ava? Why is one causing heart sickness and the other one is described as a tree of life? And in some way, that's exactly where we're going with this, is trying to say, well, sometimes it'll get lost, but sometimes it happens right away. And what's the difference?
In the first explanation, it seemed to be critical of the process of hoping. It's, it was saying, and you'll be judged for it, etc. Whereas this one is more just sort of saying, well, it's not your fault, that's just the way things, shit happens, and
basically
there's a lot of stars that have to align for your hope to be realized, and quite often they don't align. And that can be disappointing. So it feels a lot less condemnatory.
And less personal.
Yeah,
it's less personal. It's not because someone looked at your deeds and went, "Oh, I don't know, you don't seem like you earned it." It's just like you said, shit happens. The world doesn't really work the way it's supposed to.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's better or worse.
I mean, it makes me think of gambling, like a gambler's fallacy, like explicitly, like the idea of, say, buying a lottery ticket. Like this broken hope that doesn't go anywhere seems to be the same hope you might have of like that you might attach to trying to win the lottery from that ticket.
Yeah,
it's theoretically possible, but extremely mathematically unlikely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what they do with the second half of the verse. Sorry, do you want to keep going?
Okay. But as desire comes true is a tree of life, a hope not delayed among those empowered chariots. Rather, the Blessed Holy One grants it immediately. For when it is delayed among those chariots empowered, numerous masters of judgment are authorized to examine and scrutinize his case before it is granted. But whatever issues from the palace of the king is bestowed upon is bestowed upon a person is granted immediately, whether he is deserving or not. But this is but a desire come true is a tree of life.
Okay, so how do they distinguish why the verse from Proverbs says a desire come true is a tree of life? What's the difference between a hope deferred and a desire come true?
When it comes true, it comes direct from God.
Yeah.
So God cuts through the red tape, and
there's no scrutiny, right? There's no angel looking at it going, I don't know about this one. Somehow, sometimes, one will get right through all the way to the top. And when it's approved, it goes immediately back down into the world. There's no messing about. Why does this desire cut through the red tape and that one gets stuck and delayed?
Well, I think, isn't it, as Daniel said, it's because God has said it be so.
It's granted immediately.
No delays on God's part. let's just poke at the footnote here and see what he has to say. A worthy prayer is granted immediately by the Blessed Holy One, who is known as Tree of Life. Okay, so, so this is Danny Matt saying that actually the distinction is unworthy prayers can be delayed interminably, passed from one heavenly power to another, never reaching the destination, never fulfilled on earth. But a worthy prayer is granted immediately by the Blessed Holy One. So it's about the content of one's desire. And this goes back to something we said earlier about kind of connecting it to a tree of life is like saying it has to be holy, right, and sacred in terms of what it is you're wishing for. If you're going, I'd really love a new car, maybe actually that's not a worthy prayer. But if you're praying for peace on earth, maybe that's something that actually that cuts right through and goes right to God. If only it worked that way.
It's interesting that the commentary talks about worthy and unworthy, but it's not in the text, is it?
No, that's Danny Matt's interpretation of it.
Yeah, that's a very hard interpretation because, like if you've got a very sick child and you pray and then the child dies, then you think you're unworthy if you take that interpretation. I think it's a very judgmental interpretation. Sorry,
I happen to agree. Like you said, the Zohar doesn't really say that. It doesn't really give us a rubric as to why one thing gets through and one thing doesn't. It almost feels like it's kind of describing it totally descriptively, not prescriptively. It's not telling you if you wanted to get through to it this way. It's just explaining this is why sometimes people get what they want and sometimes they don't. It's because sometimes it gets to God directly and sometimes it doesn't. But it's not really saying why one thing does and one thing doesn't. Okay, they're going to continue this thread of interpreting this verse, but now we're actually going to get to the topic of Joseph in the story. Someone else want to read from the second alternatively here in purple?
I will.
No, go on then.
Alternatively, hope deferred, Jacob, whose hope for Joseph was delayed for such a long time.
Go on. Yeah.
But a desire come true is a tree of life. Benjamin, because from the moment that Joseph demanded to see him until he arrived only a short time elapsed, there was no delay. As is written, he raised his eyes and saw Benjamin, his brother, his mother's son. What does his mother's son mean? His mother's image appeared in him. His image resembled that of Rachel, so it is written, his mother's son.
Okay, so how did I interpret this verse now, actually applying it to the context and the characters of Genesis?
They're saying that because Benjamin appeared quite swiftly, that was a worthy request, if that's the right word, a worthy desire.
Yeah, I mean, Joseph's the one that makes it happen. He's not saying, oh, I wish Benjamin would show up. He manipulates everyone in the situation to make sure they bring Benjamin back by holding one of the other brothers hostage. So he's not just passively waiting for it to happen.
There's no intermittent steps as well, like Jacob's hope. He's going to see Joseph again, but not until Joseph's been thrown in a pit and sold as a slave and gone to prison in Egypt. And there's all these parts in the middle, whereas seeing Benjamin is basically a single demand and it's granted.
Yeah. So you're two very different characters here, each wanting to see a family member, right? Jacob, who's kind of held out hope all these years that maybe Joseph isn't dead, even though his other sons brought him the tunic soaked in blood that Joseph was wearing and said, I think he got eaten by a wild animal. Somehow he still kind of believes that maybe Joseph is alive somewhere. And he hopes against hope that maybe someday he'll see him. And he will. Not quite yet in the story, but he will, right? He comes down to Egypt and sees him. But that hope is delayed for such a long time, right? He was 13, now he's in his late 30s. It's been at least 20 years, probably more. Meanwhile, Joseph hears that Benjamin is around, but they didn't bring him with the first time, and manages to ensure a situation where they bring him back the next time. He didn't have to wait very long at all. So they're applying this verse in that sense. Sorry, Robin.
No, I mean, just the English idiom, it's the hope that kills you, sort of springs to mind.
Familiar to Spurs fans, yes.
Well, yeah, no, we don't have any hope. But yeah, it's like for Jacob, that sort of faint hope that if he'd been able to come to peace with the fact that Joseph wasn't alive, even though he was, then he may have had a more comfortable 20 years or whatever it was.
His hope makes him a bitter, angry person, right? Who, when we see him in these stories, is not really sympathetic at all.
Yeah. So and that sort of does sort of translate to the proverb at the beginning of the sickness of the heart, or whatever it was. Yeah.
Sorry, don't mean to interrupt.
No, I'm finished.
I was going to say that it seems like his hope is also kind of unjustified, because if he'd have not doted so heavily on Joseph and maybe paid more attention to his other sons, that he would never have been in that position in the first place.
Yeah, he doesn't ever seem to realize that. Instead, he does what he did to Joseph to Benjamin, and jealously guards him. And you know, one of the other, Reuben, says, "Oh, I'll kill both my sons if I don't bring Benjamin back safely." What a crazy move! How messed up is his family that Reuben tells his dad, "Well, if I don't bring my brother back safely, I'll kill my own sons instead," which just is like, you know, deeply unhealthy. But that's that environment that Jacob's created out of his favoritism and his own depression over Joseph's seeming death.
And then that same chart, the what's the word? The surrogate Joseph treatment of Benjamin again contributes to this unjustified, or rather Joseph's apparent justified desire to see him. It's the same mechanic at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. He's replaying the family trauma. That never happens, of course. Okay, let's go on a bit more. They're going to go on a few tangents, but it's worth it. Daniel, do you want to read the next chunk? Rabbi Yossi goes on this tangent, which is worth just reading briefly.
Rabbi Yossi said, "Look, it was written previously. Joseph saw Benjamin with them," Genesis 43:16. "And now is written, he raised his eyes and saw Benjamin." What is this seeing? Actually, he saw through the Holy Spirit that Benjamin would have a share with them in the land, and that Shekhinah would dwell in the share of Benjamin and Judah, for he saw the temple standing in their share. This is Joseph saw Benjamin with them. Him he saw with them, whereas Joseph, his brother, he did not see with them in that share. Similarly, he raised his eyes and saw Benjamin. What is written next? Joseph hurried out because his love for his brother kindled and he wanted to weep.
Okay. Common theme in the Joseph story, by the way, is he's just overcome with emotion, has to run out of the room because he needs to cry. This whole interpretation is dwelling on the fact that the verse says twice that Joseph saw Benjamin, and anytime the Torah repeats itself, the Zohar assumes that it means two different things, because it assumes no repetition is accidental. Everything is meaningful. And so it says that the second repetition, which he raised his eyes and saw Benjamin, is actually him seeing the future, right? And seeing the distant future from his point of view back in, 1500 BCE, looking all the way ahead to when the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BCE, 700 years after Joseph lived. And after that, only 2 tribes managed to survive. 10 were destroyed. 2 of them survive in the southern kingdom of Judah, which is the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. So it's mostly Judah, but also Benjamin is also settled down there near Jerusalem. And as a result, those are the only 2 tribes that survive. That's why we're called Jews today, right? Because actually it was the tribe of Judah that predominantly survived in the kingdom of Judah, but Benjamin was also there. Left out of this vision of the future is the fact the tribe of Benjamin is going to be genocidally murdered by all the other tribes in a war that takes place at the end of the book of Judges, and they only leave 200 men alive. He doesn't seem to see that part of the future, but he sees this idea that someday It'll be the tribe of Benjamin that remains with Judah after the destruction of the northern kingdom. That's what the Zohar imagines, at least. Okay, now that Joseph's seen the future, let's continue on that thread briefly now with Rabbi Chizkiah, who has a different interpretation. They're all just sharing their different views here. Robin, do you want to read from Rabbi Chizkiah here in the pink?
Rabbi Chizkiah opened, Oracle of the Valley of Vision. What has happened to you now that you have gone, all of you, up on the roofs? Isaiah 22:1.
Completely unrelated verse, right? He's just quoted this out of nowhere, this verse from Isaiah, which is described as an oracle of a valley in vision. And he describes everyone going up on the roofs. So he's brought this out of nowhere. We'll see what he does with it.
Come and see, as has been established, as the temple was being destroyed, consumed by fire, all the priests scaled the heights of the temple with all the keys in their hands and exclaimed, until now we have been your treasurers. From now on, take what is yours.
What a crazy image, by the way, just to say, right? This image of the temple on fire and the priests climbing up to the roof to try and escape the flames, holding the keys to the temple and yelling at God, saying, we've been in charge until now, but you got to take it back. This is an incredibly bizarre image, right? That evidently Isaiah is seeing in a vision.
What does it actually say? Because obviously it's paraphrasing to what is yours. What does it actually say?
What do you mean? In the Zohar here, it must just say from now on take, because he's inserting that. Let's see if he says anything helpful. This story appears in various versions and rabbinic sources. He gives all the sources where it appears. So this is a known story, which is why he fills in some of the gaps. We had this story of the priest climbing the top of the temple and trying to hand the keys back to God. Okay, let's carry on, right? Chizkiah is still interpreting this Isaiah verse. He's going to go on for a little while.
Come and see, Valley of Vision is Shekhinah, who resided in the temple and from whom all inhabitants of the world sucked the milk of prophecy. For although all prophets prophesied from another site, from her they absorbed their prophecy. So she is called Valley of Vision. Vision, as has been established, for she is a visionary mirror reflecting all supernal colors.
Okay, so again, reading that beginning of the Isaiah quote, which begins, Oracle of the Valley of Vision, the Zohar, Rabbi Chizkiah, is reading Valley of Vision as one of the many names for Shekhinah. Fascinating imagery here in terms of the feminization of God, describing prophecy as being the experience of the inhabitants of the world suckling her milk, right? This very, obviously, very deeply maternal imagery. And so she is used, the language of valley is the very feminine language in many ways, for obvious reasons. And they describe her elsewhere as a visionary mirror reflecting all colors, right? All of this imagery around prophecy and around the role that Shekhinah played. Shekhinah, who, according to this mythology, dwelled in the temple before it was destroyed.
Is that prophecy? So I think I'd always thought of prophecy as being forward-looking, but actually, maybe it's just more expansionary than.
Yeah, prophecy is kind of the wrong word in English for what we mean in Hebrew when we talk about nevi'ut. It's less about telling the future and more about communication with God. And prophecy is like God is a radio station and you tune yourself in and you can hear. And it's really about hearing. It's that auditory experience. And they acknowledge here, as they do elsewhere, that many people of many nations experienced that prophecy, and all of it came from this experience of Shekhinah when she was in the temple, when she was this mirror reflecting all colors, when she was this valley of vision. Incredibly graphic, fascinating, imagistic language. Okay, so we're still playing with this verse where we are going to get somewhere with it. He likes to talk, this one. So let's keep going, Robin.
What has happened to you now that you have gone, all of you, up on the roofs? For when Jerusalem was destroyed, Shekhinah ascended and visited all those places where she had previously dwelled, and she wept for her dwelling and for Israel who were going into exile, and for all the righteous and pious who had been there and perished. How do we know? As is written, a voice is heard on a height, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, from Jeremiah. As has been said.
So we've seen this verse before, just to say sorry, we've seen this verse before, a famous verse applied to Shekhinah, where Rachel is actually understood to be kind of coterminous with Shekhinah. And this idea of Rachel weeping for her children is sewn into the myth that when the temple was destroyed, the Shekhinah was exiled from it, and as a result went around looking at all of the destroyed sanctuaries and crying and weeping before following the Israelites into exile. Okay.
Then the Blessed Holy One asked Shekhinah, what has happened to you now that you have gone, all of you, up on the roofs? Why all of you? That you have gone up would have been sufficient. Why all of you? To include all the other forces and chariots, all of whom wept along with her over the destruction of the temple. So, what has happened to you? She replied before him, my children are in exile, and the temple is burnt. So what is left for me here? She began to say, full of commotion, tumultuous city, exuberant town. Therefore, I say, look away from me, let me weep bitterly, from Isaiah. And we have established that the Blessed Holy One said to her, restrain your voice from weeping, from Jeremiah.
Okay, let's just go on and finish this chunk because he's really on a roll here.
Come and see, ever since the day that the temple was destroyed, there has never been a day without curses. For when the temple existed, Israel would perform rituals, bringing offerings and sacrifices, and Shekhinah hovered over them in the temple like a mother over her children. All faces were radiant, so that blessings appeared above and below. There was never a day without blessings and joys. Israel dwelled securely in the land, and the whole world was nourished because of them. Now that the temple is destroyed and Shekhinah is with them in exile, no day passes without curses. The world is cursed, and joy cannot be found above or below. But one day the Blessed Holy One intends to raise assembly of Israel from the dust, as has been said, and to delight the world utterly, as is said, I will bring them to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. And it is written, with weeping they will come, and with consolations I will guide them. And as previously is written, she weeps bitterly in the night. So later they will return in weeping, as is written, with weeping they will come.
Okay. Thank you, Robin. So we've got this restatement of the myth that we've seen many times. And part of the reason I wanted to look at this passage is because it's kind of got everything. It's a greatest hits of the Zohar in some way. You've got a hyper literal reading of a verse from Proverbs, which has this moral, ethical dimension, right, regarding prayer and hope and desire and this way in which they kind of create these beings out of emotional states. They then apply that rationale to the actual story we're meant to be talking about briefly, right, around Joseph and Jacob and their desires and how one is fulfilled and one is delayed and why that might be. And then we've got this quite long and really very kind of fantastical restatement from Rabbi Chizkiah of the central myth of the Zohar, which is about this idea that once upon a time, the Holy Blessed One and the Shekhinah, the male and female aspects of God, dwelt peacefully when the temple stood in ancient Israel. And when the temple was destroyed, they were estranged from one another. She went into exile with her children in this very kind of maternal protective way. He disappeared off into the heights. And as a result, we're left with this broken world in which nothing actually works as it's supposed to. prophecy has been cut off. Curses are uttered every day. They use what dramatic language here? What is it? Never a day. Oh, there was never a day without blessings and joys back then. And now never a day passes where joy cannot be found above or below, right? It's like a complete opposite then and now. And ultimately, this is here for a reason, connecting it to this idea of desire and hope. So why does Rabbi Hizkiah go on to this long story restating the myth of the exile of Shekhinah here when we're debating this verse from Proverbs?
Well, I was going to say, it's a bit strange in some ways because, like, they could hope for sort of the re-establishment of Israel in the future, but while they're hoping for it, that's their hearts are full of sickness or whatever. But I don't know if that's a misinterpretation.
No, I don't think so. I don't think there is such a thing. I think it's somewhat unclear why this is here and what the connection is between these passages. We have to assume that's intentional.
Being Joseph's in exile, isn't he?
Yes.
So maybe it's connected to that in some way. The theme of exile, of not being.
It makes me.
Sorry, go on, Lee.
I was going to say it makes me wonder what the Zohar thinks to the Amidah.
Say more.
Well, so it's obviously this a chunk of the blessings are about desire, and also the role of it sort of being a sort of surrogate for the temple services in exile. And I'm just wondering how that overlaps with this hope and desire framing.
Yes, we ask God to desire our sacrifices and want things to be rebuilt. We kind of impose a certain emotional request.
Maybe there's something about the fact that that's hope for the temple to be rebuilt. But in the time before it was destroyed, they were able to pray freely and their desires were realized because they had that channel to God. And so the tree of life, the tree of life was there, but the destruction of the temple meant that mechanism no longer, that channel was destroyed or blocked, and so that's where the sickness of the heart exists, because they don't have that channel to God.
Yeah, very much so. There's the Zohar's main thrust in some ways, this idea that things once upon a time were wonderful, right? Everything worked as it should. Shekhinah was in the temple stood. As a result, Israel would perform rituals, bringing offerings and sacrifices. She would hover over them. Blessings were fulfilled. It all happened as it should, right? The desires were immediately realized. And then with the rupture, the catastrophe, the destruction of the temple, which not only destroyed a physical building, but destroyed the kind of cohesion of the Shekhinah and the Holy Blessed One. Now they're separated and estranged. The world is broken, right? Essentially, the Zohar is kind of the first ever existentialist text, right? In which it's suggesting that kind of we live in a broken world. Things don't work the way they're supposed to. They used to, and it wants us to understand why they don't work the way they're supposed to. It's not impossible they could do so again, but we have to accept in some way that in the world in which we live, the post-catastrophe world, which the Zohar is speaking to, things don't work the way they're supposed to. Prayers are not always answered. Desires don't always come to fruition. sometimes hope is deferred for a very long time, and sometimes suddenly desire will come out and be a tree of life and be productive and help one grow. But it's very hard to predict why or when, because nothing's working the way it's supposed to.
And Jacob's family life can also be a metaphor for that, right? Although one probably doesn't think that pre-Joseph's faked death and incarceration, it was really as perfect as might have been. But to Jacob, maybe it was, because he was oblivious to all the other crap that was going on.
Yeah, it might very well be that he imagines and romanticizes how great it was, right, when Joseph was there. And they are all reunited at the end of the story. As the book of Genesis concludes, Jacob goes down to Egypt. He dies in Egypt. He dies with Joseph's 2 sons on his knees, right? Everything is put back the way it should be, and yet it's not quite the same way as it was before. And there's a real kind of very modern sensibility about much of this, which is not really, and we saw this with the attempt to kind of make a commentary that makes it all make sense, which Lorraine, you reacted to quite negatively, I think fairly, a little bit ago, right? Which is that actually the Zohar isn't really about making sense. If we can say anything about the Zohar as a whole, it's that it's not that interested in presenting a clear, philosophically sound and consistent approach to the world. It's much more focused on the emotional reaction to the world being a broken place, and trying to give us myths and images and poetic ways of understanding why that is and what we should do about it, which in some ways is a very modern kind of type of writing. It's almost literary in the way it approaches the existential crisis of humanity. It does so in its own way, right, and very much entrenched in the interpretation of the Torah, where we're constantly bringing in verses and knocking them against each other. But in some way, the reason it continues to resonate, and perhaps resonates now more than ever before, is because it does really appreciate what it's like to live in a world where you think nothing works the way it's supposed to, where everything feels a bit broken. And in some way, it can be a great comfort as a result, because it's people thinking similarly about their own time, whether that's post-temple destruction or post-Spanish expulsion, or current post-Holocaust confusing time that we're in now. These moments in Jewish history when catastrophe erupts and we try and deal with it, these kind of texts always have certain meaning, and they do or can for us today. So hopefully you've gained something from looking at this bizarre, medieval, mystical, mythological mess that is the Zohar. There's a lot there and a lot to gain from it, and I encourage you to pick up Danny Matt's translation, which is excellent. And to read and study it, and his footnotes make it much easier to do so. But this is the end of the journey for us this year, at least in our Zohar on Zoom group. So thank you very much for joining us. And to those who watch online and can't always make it in person, thank you as well. And join us again next year for all sorts of other exciting programs in our Olive 2024 program.
Thank you so much, Adam.